ADHD, but I'm going to stress, and I'm going to emphasize this a couple times, that when treated and when managed, these things don't become the sort of poor prognosis or bad health issues. It's when ADHD is unmanaged, undiagnosed, untreated. But the truth is that a landmark study actually done a couple of years ago by Russell Barkley, who is the leading authority on ADHD research, that we owe an immense amount of gratitude for the work that he continues to contribute to the ADHD world. Barkley and Fisher did a study where they looked at the impact of untreated and unmanaged ADHD on life expectancy. And so they plugged in all of this data in an actuarial database calculator developed by the University of Connecticut. And they found that compared to a control group, adults with ADHD had 11 to 13 years reduced life expectancy. And that when they looked at all of there were 14 risk factors, that 9 of them, including education, hygiene practices, weight, nutrition, exercise, sleep, driving risks, and tobacco and alcohol use, were all areas that could be significantly impacted by ADHD. The primary factors that significantly reduce life expectancy were these 3 traits. One is called low conscientiousness, basically not being cognizant or mindful of certain behaviors or activities. Poor self-regulation, having a hard time being mindful and regulating your actions and your behaviors. High impulsivity in terms of decisions that people might make. Now, again, I'm going to stress that treatment for ADHD, along with the related health risks it might pose, can add an average of 9 to 13 years to the lifespan of those diagnosed with ADHD. So that's the hopeful message. So what do we know about the ADHD brain before we get into some of the health sections? One is that we know there are different neurochemicals in the ADD in every brain. One is dopamine, and when we have low levels of dopamine or less available dopamine, our brain is under-aroused, it's under-stimulated. An ADHD brain by baseline has low levels of dopamine. So the ADD brain is an under-aroused, bored brain at baseline. So as I say, I having ADHD myself, that I feel that people with ADHD were oriented, our orientation to the environment is what is going to stimulate me, pure and simple. And that's coming from a very biochemical reason, because we're craving that level of stimulation. In addition, there's another neurotransmitter called GABA. When we have appropriate levels of GABA, we're appropriately inhibited from maybe doing behaviors or making decisions that could get us into trouble. People with ADHD, low levels of GABA. So now you have an uninhibited, understimulated brain. Executive functions, which is part of ADHD, it takes a longer time for the frontal lobe to mature in ADHD brains. So we know that people with ADHD, particularly prior to the age of 25, Russell Barkley actually says you almost want to think of the executive functions as being third less their chronological age. So executive functions are very different than our intelligence. Our executive function is time management and organization and working memory. So if you're an 18-year-old with ADHD, you may have the executive functions of a 12-year-old. You can have the intellectual capacity of a 30-year-old, but very different than our executive functions. We know that ADHD runs in families. It's incredibly heritable. And there are genes that actually are implicated with ADHD, including the DRD4 gene, which is also implicated in risk-taking and reward-seeking. Now, as I mentioned with the executive functions, we're talking about the ability to regulate attention, basically putting attention where we need to put it in, moving it away when we need to move it away. Having ADHD, we have trouble starting things and stopping things. We have trouble starting things that we're not so thrilled about, have difficulty stopping things that we're really thrilled about. Our ability to monitor our actions, to organize, to plan, prioritize, manage time, regulate our emotions, which has actually sort of been a newer conceptualization of emotional regulation as an executive function. ADHD is not about knowing what to do most of the time. It's really about doing what you know. We often say like attention deficit disorder should be called intention deficit disorder because it's really about executing or actualizing your intentions. So what did Barkley and colleagues also find from these health studies? From research that he has done and lots of other researchers who have looked at this field found that people with ADHD have a greater risk for accidental injuries, greater risk for more risky sexual behaviors, have poorer oral hygiene, more likely to get cavities and root canals. And again, when we think about these things like brushing your teeth, I worked with someone some years ago, and the parent was so disturbed that she found out her son hadn't brushed his teeth in a year. And she thought there is something seriously wrong. And I said, well, the truth is many people with ADHD, a lot of high functioning adults that I work with, they might swish with some Listerine, but they don't always brush their teeth because that is a routine thing that we have to do at least twice or 3 times a day. And it's those kinds of things that people with ADHD have sometimes trouble with. Higher risk of type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular incidents, even by the age of 30, and higher risk of hypertension. Now I'm going to talk about some specific areas of health, and mind you, I could give a 3-hour presentation on any one of these topics alone, and I have. So I'm going to try to condense it, and I'm going to throw you a lot of information. So first is when it comes to eating. And if you think about it, healthy eating really does require a level of executive functions. And we know that people with ADHD have trouble with that. One study in 2012 looked in a simulated lab of a kitchen area, basically, where they had kids between 10 and 14. They assessed them for mood, for impulsivity, for loss of control in terms of their eating, and basically let them be and monitor their food intake, how many calories they ingested, and so forth. And they found that the kids who had ADHD ate more when controlling for all other variables. Now, what was striking about that is they ate more. It was not influenced by any mood state. It was not influenced by their level of hunger, and it wasn't even influenced by their liking of food. So kids with ADHD ate more of foods they didn't even like, simply because it was there. Potachik also found people with ADHD had more disruptive eating habits, ate less nutritious diets, also were significantly drawn to foods or beverages with higher sugar intake. In a study looking at, it's a small study, but looked at children who presented in an obesity clinic and had them screened for ADHD. These were all kids who were morbidly obese. They did not meet criteria for any other DSM-4 diagnosis, so no depression, anxiety. They found that almost 60% of them had ADHD, which is significantly higher than what you would see in the general population. Of the children with ADHD, only 40% of them had been even diagnosed before the study. Similarly, when looking at adult patients, they find that adults who present in a bariatric who are getting gastric bypass surgery, so adults who are significantly overweight, who are obese, found that almost a third, 27%, had attention deficit disorder. Now, interestingly, for when they even sampled to people who were of a body mass index over 40, which is morbidly obese, that 43% of them had ADHD. And so not only in terms of that, but even post-surgery, they found that the group with ADHD lost less weight even after getting the same surgical procedure. So that there was something about ADHD that made it difficult to manage that manage food intake and then also manage even post-surgical recommendations. Now, one might say, if you're hyperactive, wouldn't that burn calories? Like if you're a kid that's bouncing off the walls, would that protect you against obesity? Well, that was the hypothesis that Holtkamp in a 2004 study had asked, and found that the opposite was actually found, that of the almost 100 patients with ADHD, that their weight was significantly higher than a peer-matched sample of control subjects. And again, when they found that of those individuals whose body mass index was over the 90th percentile, that ADHD was significantly more common than in the reference group. So why is that? Why is healthy eating tough for people with ADHD? Well, again, to eat healthily, we have to organize. We have to plan meals if we're in a position of making meals, especially for other people. And we say in the ADHD world, there are two time zones. There's the now and the not now zone. And a lot of times the clients that I work with, they don't think about what they're going to make until they're hungry. And we all know if we're ravenously hungry, we're not going to sit and sift through a recipe and find the ingredients. We want something quick and we want something fast. So a lot of times those executive skills needed to get ingredients, to think about what food might need to be thawed or defrosted beforehand, bagging our lunch so that in the morning we go to work or go to school, with the lunch versus relying on vending machines or fast food. They find that adults with ADHD are less likely to have a supermarket list and tend to buy more impulsively. People with ADHD also have a hard time self-regulating. They tend to vastly underestimate the amount of calories that they eat. And I have this sort of exercise with patients of mine with ADHD who have issues with overeating or binge eating or who are looking for healthy weight loss. I'll have them either keep a log or just take a picture of everything they eat. And when they look back, when we're in session together and they look back, they're almost surprised by how much they ate. They're like, oh, I forgot about that. Oh my gosh, I totally forgot about that. And that includes every time they snack on things, not just meals, because again, all of those also add extra calories. There's a term that really comes a lot from the eating disorder community known as interoceptive awareness, which is our awareness of what's happening in our bodies. Am I hungry? Am I satisfied? Am I thirsty? And people with ADHD have poor interoceptive awareness. ADHD is, I think of it as almost like a way of being that you're focused on the outside of what's going to stimulate me from the outside in versus really needing to work at that muscle to even attune to like what's happening internally. People with ADHD often have poor sleep habits, and I'm going to talk about sleep actually in a moment. But what a lot of people don't know is that sleep deprivation is a major contributor to obesity. That when we are sleep deprived, there's a hormone called leptin that gets decreased, which actually increases body fat storage and lowers our metabolism. So our evolution is trying to keep us alive, that if we're not sleeping, our brain assumes that some higher order need, like food, is being threatened. And so it will hold on to your body fat while lowering your metabolism and increasing craving for fat, simple carbs, and sugar. It's that simple. So we are really doing our body a disservice when we are sleep deprived, because then we're sleep deprived, relying on quick sort of empty calories, typically in sugar, which then becomes a double whammy when it comes to our weight. People with ADHD can skip meals due to hyperfocus, and often, which then leads to overeating later on. And they're more likely to do other things while eating, as this picture demonstrates. Sometimes people with ADHD say that they're good multitaskers, and sometimes it's not good to be a good multitasker. I've had patients tell me that they eat while driving, which is obviously very dangerous, that they never sit down for a meal. They're always standing up and eating. That's not good because we're not attuning. We're not going to be as aware of what we're eating. Biologically, there are dopamine receptors in our brain that overlap with both obesity and ADHD. So this is biologically wired. And as I mentioned, the low levels of dopamine create what's called a reward deficiency syndrome, where someone with ADHD is always craving some dopamine-related behavior. And I'll talk later about cannabis, which is one of them, but food, particularly the food that people are attracted to, and in those kinds of ways are dopamine inducing. As I said, like I've never worked with anyone who's ever binged on kale, for example. Not something you're going to see because it doesn't deliver that dopamine burst as potato chips, as ice cream, sugar will do. So what do? In a nutshell, we want to teach mindful eating practices, being aware of portion control. How do you eat? How quickly do you eat? People with ADHD, when I've done, when I was seeing people in the office before COVID, that we would do sort of have meals in the office, and a lot of people with ADHD will eat super fast. Having ADHD, my mom used to say that even as an infant, that she, you know, would put food on the high chair, the tray, and you'd put food and typically kids will pick. She goes, I would like scoop it all up and shove it in my mouth, and I'd look like, you know, a chipmunk, like literally like shoving it. And she realized, oh, I can't put that all on the tray for Roberto because he's putting, but that's how, I mean, we're talking when I was 6, 7 months old. Like, I mean, this is that hardwired. Having healthy staples and snacks in the house really help. Trying to limit your sugar and simple carbs. Sugar does not cause ADHD, which is one of those myths you might still hear. It doesn't necessarily exacerbate ADHD, but people with ADHD love sugar and they love it a lot. And the reason that it can exacerbate some of the ADHD symptoms is more what the person is not eating because they're eating that sugar. A lot of nutritionists and dietitians really stress that, yes, what we put in our body is super important, but what we don't put in our body is also very noteworthy. Because if you're eating a lot of sugar and filling up on soda, you're not eating protein, you're not eating calcium, you're not eating magnesium, omega-3s, and all of those other nutrients. Understand people with ADHD are also craving sensory input, which food provides for us. And it smells good, it tastes good, we touch it, we can hear it crunch. All of that is very reinforcing to an ADD brain. Eating regularly, setting up structure, especially for the nighttime, which could be a hard time for a lot of people. Creating a list of other behaviors when people aren't really hungry, but they're just looking for stimulation, and sleep hygiene. Now I'm going to move to sleep, as we talked about, because people with ADHD, again, I don't know anyone with ADHD that doesn't have some issue with sleep. And if I had much more time, I could tell you my own personal experience, but I could be a poster child for sleep disorders. I've had all of the things I'm about to mention. People with ADHD have difficulty falling asleep, sort of shutting their brain down. And this is true even as far as infancy. As, you know, again, retrospectively, my mom saying I was nocturnal as an infant. I just wanted to be up all night and sleep during the day, and my circadian rhythms were totally off. And being the youngest of 3, that didn't go over well for my poor parents, who had to be up for my older brother and sister. People with ADHD could be unwilling to nap even when exhausted. Sometimes feel energetic towards like 10 o'clock when a lot of people are starting to wind down. People with ADHD can have a second wind and often will want to go to bed later, and often have difficulty waking up. And not just because they're not getting enough sleep, but even with ample sleep, even with 8 or 9 hours sleep, the morning times, especially, this is especially true for kids and adolescents, is like zombie time. And I could attest to my high school years, it was like waking up the dead. I mean, I can have an alarm clock like right here and I'd sleep through it in that way. People with ADHD have difficulty maintaining alertness throughout the day unless they're engaged in something super stimulating. And so those could be the kids that are falling asleep in class, as was my high school experience, and often known as like a borderline narcolepsy. A quarter of people with ADHD have something called restless leg syndrome, where there are these involuntary twitches of the leg. And we almost think of it as like a hyperactivity still occurring in a sense, like even when the person is sleeping. Sleep talking, sleepwalking, teeth grinding or bruxism, bedwetting, all very common in people with ADD. Sleep paralysis, which if no one knows what that is, it's basically you wake up out of REM sleep and our bodies are paralyzed in REM sleep. So when we wake up from REM sleep, we're conscious and our motor functions resume. Well, for people with sleep paralysis, and I had this and haven't had it in a while, but as a kid was a common experience. You wake up in consciousness, but your body is still paralyzed. And it is a terrifying feeling. I can't describe, like, and your chest feels very, very tight and you know you're awake, but you can't move. And it feels like it lasts 5 minutes, but it's probably 20, 30 seconds, but it is a very, very scary thing. Obstructive sleep apnea, which is when your oxygen levels are desaturated or basically you're not breathing. And I want to stress, particularly with sleep apnea, is I was under the impression that, I mean, clearly the more weight that you have, and particularly around your neck and in chest area, you're more at risk for sleep apnea. However, there are a lot of anatomical reasons you can also have sleep apnea. And I got a sleep study years ago after having a patient with sleep apnea and ADHD, read about sleep apnea for the sake of my patient and understanding it. And I thought, like I can relate to a lot of these symptoms. And I was like, let me get a sleep study. Well, it turned out I had a severely deviated septum in my nose. My tonsils almost touch each other. My whole throat like closes up, and I was off the charts, sleep apnea. So if the biggest hallmark symptom of it is really bad snoring, like the kind of snoring that people are like, oh my gosh, you sound like a drill. Studies show that about a quarter of the ADHD population has a diagnosable sleep disorder. About 50% of children with ADHD will have a sleep disorder by the age of 18. And numerous studies have found children with ADHD having decreased REM sleep, which is actually our dream sleep, which is responsible for a feeling of being refreshed and replenished in the morning. So that feeling, or rather the lack of, in the morning, you might hear from your children with ADHD saying, I don't feel refreshed in the morning. I don't know, I don't understand that. That's hardwired in that way. Now, you can start to sort of get more and more in that feeling. In my case, when I started using the CPAP, it made all the difference. More daytime sleepiness, circadian rhythm abnormalities, and often slept less. ADHD teenagers, more likely to have current and lifetime sleep problems, insomnia, sleep terrors, which are basically nightmares that occur outside of REM sleep. So the sleep terrors are often accompanied by a lot of physical movement because we're only paralyzed during REM sleep. We're not paralyzed during other aspects of sleep. Nightmares, snoring, and the use of methylphenidate, an ADHD medication, was not associated with further risk of those sleep problems, which sometimes is a concern that people might have. In a very large meta-analysis study that looked at 722 kids with ADHD versus 638 controls, found on every index of sleep problems, bedtime resistance, sleep onset difficulties, night awakenings, sleep breathing difficulties, all much higher in people with ADHD. So why is that? Biologically, having ADHD involves dopaminergic systems, as I mentioned earlier with dopamine, but also serotonin systems, which is another neurotransmitter. And sleep involves serotonin and GABA. And as I mentioned before, GABA is implicated with ADHD. So now you have this sort of interesting cross intersection of sleep involving serotonin and GABA, ADHD that involves serotonin. We also know GABA, that it can cause this disruption basically in a serotonin system. Many people with ADHD, and I'm one of these people, have what's actually called a delayed sleep phase syndrome, where their circadian rhythms are almost shifted. So that 10 o'clock second wind is almost like what might happen to other people at like 7 or 8 o'clock. And then getting tired at 1 a.m., 2 a.m. is what happens to people maybe at 11 o'clock. They found that children with ADHD have a delayed melatonin onset. And then we also know that the prefrontal cortex, which takes longer to mature in people with ADHD, that is a critical role that plays in arousal and sleep and attention. And so a lot of times with ADHD, it will affect other systems that houses, including sleep. ADHD symptoms, though, can also lead to sleep issues. Lots of kids and teens, particularly with ADHD, might be attracted to high stimulating behaviors like video games or intense movies and things like that right before they go to bed. That's almost they're going from this activated, stimulated mindset to this drop in dopamine. Makes it very, very hard to fall asleep. Genetically, there's a gene called catecholomethyltransferase, or COMT, which basically inactivates dopamine, and that's also implicated in sleep regulation. And then genes that are associated with sleep can also be inherited, as is with ADHD. So how do we help with that? First of all, if you suspect that you or your child has sleep apnea, please get a sleep study. It's literally life-saving, because I can tell you from my experience, and granted mine was off the charts. I mean, you need 20 events in an hour over 3 hours to be diagnosed with sleep apnea. At least that was when I got diagnosed. I had 98 average in an hour, of which I told my sleep doctor, well, I can be an overachiever. But it was, so I have to have the CPAP the rest of my life. But what the doctor told me, because non-compliance is very common, a lot of people don't want to use, I mean, this is what it looks like. No one, there's nothing sexy about a CPAP. But she said, and this was, you know, how many, almost 15 years ago or so that I got diagnosed. And she said, you're I'm an otherwise very healthy person. And she says, if this was not caught, you could be somebody that dies of a heart attack in the middle of the night. And everyone at 50, which I'm only a year away from 50 now, that she said, like, everyone would be like, how did that even happen? And she goes, there are a lot of cardiovascular events that occur due to undiagnosed and untreated sleep apnea. So if you're the snorer, or if your child is, get a sleep study. And with children, it's not always the CPAP. I mean, often they'll try to yank the tonsils out. Sometimes it is a deviated septum, and that can actually be more effective for children. For adults, it's less effective, that they said, because our anatomy is grown, it's basically a done deal. So I did have my deviated septum fixed, but which helps with daytime breathing. But she said, even if you take my tonsils out, I'm still going to need it. As far as maintaining alertness throughout the day, introducing stimulating sensory behaviors to, you know, not have people fall asleep, relaxation exercises to sort of calm the body down before sleep. A warm bath can sometimes help. Trying to unplug, which is tough for young people, even a half hour, 45 minutes before bed, to not have, you know, blue light or television, YouTube could be helpful. Changing in your pajamas hours before you go to bed, almost like basically telling yourself, oh, I guess it's time for me to go to sleep. Dimming the lights, and cool rooms often do very well. Keeping the room cool, but having, you know, heavy blankets or sheets, warm sheets. Sound machines, light music. You know, for younger children, singing to them can be very helpful. But any patient that I work with, I'm always also assessing what their motivation is for sleep. Because I can tell you, my experience was, I looked at sleep at one point in my life as being disposable. Like, I looked at it as, this is a waste of time. I could be either A, having a lot more fun now, or B, I could be getting work done now. So it's either productivity or mischief and fun and shenanigans, as I would call them. I did not respect sleep as something that was really necessary. And that is something, if I had to talk to my younger self, that would be the main thing I would really, it took me years to really work on that. So that's always important to see where somebody is coming from. So I'm going to shift now to exercise, which is a very, very important health behavior for everybody, of course. And all of these things, of course, are helpful for everyone, but it is even more important for those with ADHD. When we exercise, we actually develop this, there's a hormone called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF, which actually increases and promotes neuronal growth and differentiation. Like, we literally are making our brain stronger when we exercise. It elevates dopamine and norepinephrine, which can almost act like a medication. And when I say act, it's not in place of medication for people who may need medication, but it definitely has a medicating effect. It wakes up the frontal lobe as well, which can be really helpful, which heightens your senses. It can reduce tension, fidgetiness. It helps with our stress response. It increases energy, focus, and motivation. And studies, even as way back in 1980, there was a study that found that 20 to 45 minutes of jogging before class reduce hyperactivity and inattention in elementary students for a 3 to 4 hour period. 2012, another study found that 20 minutes on a treadmill increased scholastic performance in a sample of children. Another study in 2012 where they randomly assigned ADHD children in exercise, non-exercise groups, found that 30 minutes of aerobic exercise produced immediately higher scores on neuropsych measures. So, and I remember in college that, without understanding why I was doing it, but I knew anytime I went to the gym, I would come home, take a shower as quick as I could, and I would dive into whatever I was procrastinating on at the time. And I was almost like riding that high. And now I understand what was actually happening, is that I really was on a, dopamine sort of more focused, energetic, and I would almost fear that I would lose it. And so I'd take a quick shower, get into that paper I was putting off. So having ADHD gets in the way, though, of routinely exercising. So it's good to commit to a specific day and time. Sometimes piggybacking it with another task that you might do. So if you have to go to CVS to pick up something, walk there, jog there instead of driving there if it's close enough. Sort of combining tasks like that can be helpful. I often recommend, particularly with a task that you don't want to do, or if your child doesn't want to do, exercising beforehand and going right into that task can often be very, very helpful, and make it a good fit for that person's ADHD traits. Not everybody, different kinds of exercise don't work for everybody. You want to make it fun and relevant so it's sustainable. Mix it up. Some people definitely need to be outdoors. Some people are fine with doing their exercise indoors. It helps if you have a friend. For accountability, we call it an account-a-buddy. Having a friend to do it with you always helps. Dressing for the occasion. So my go-to is, like, I always tell people, I never look forward to going to the gym, or I can't say I like going to the gym, but I go. I mean, again, putting COVID aside, before COVID, but what I would do is I work out. When I would go to the gym, I work out at nighttime. I'd have my gym bag here in the office, and after my last patient, I just put on the gym clothes. And I'm still not motivated to go to the gym, but I'll be like, well, I guess I'm going to the gym. Like, I'm dressed for it. And then in my head, I'm like, oh, but I don't want to go. Well, I might as well drive there. And then I am in the parking lot and I'm like, oh, I don't feel like going. And even though I have never regretted going to the gym, and after a workout, I'm actually do more than what I even intend to do, because I get in it, I'm listening to my tunes and my music. And then I'm like, Roberto, remember this feeling, because this is the next time you don't feel like going, and it's back to square one. And so people with ADHD, it's frustrating, I can see, for people who don't have ADHD, who can't relate to that, to be like, what are you talking about? Like, you felt so good last time. Why isn't that carrying over? It doesn't always carry over. Sometimes it does, but it doesn't always. Making it competitive. Apps can be really helpful at getting concrete data, like how many steps you walked, how many miles you ran, things like that. Combining it with music really, really helps. I'm going to now shift to substances, and it's very important for anyone to know, and if you're a parent of a child with ADHD, that having ADHD increases your likelihood of any addictive behavior. Now, that doesn't always mean drugs and alcohol. It could mean food, it could mean gambling, it could mean pornography, it could mean sex, it could mean video games. But basically, having ADHD, when you like something, you run the risk of liking it too much and not being able to regulate that. And that's super, super important, because what we know is that ADHD, when we're talking about substances, is 5 to 10 times more common among alcoholics than versus in control groups. Among adults being treated for drug and alcohol abuse, the rate of ADHD is about 25%. Now, I would challenge that, actually, because I would say most rehab facilities don't even screen for ADHD. And I can guarantee if they did, that rate is much higher. Now, what's so important to know is that the bridge between drug abuse and a full-on dependence is shorter. And I also meant to put there, the bridge also between experimentation and dependence is shorter for people with ADHD. And that's really important, especially for teens to know, because especially when it comes to cannabis, which I'll talk about, they'll see people and their peers and like, well, they do it, everybody, does it, or what's wrong with experimentation? Well, it's very important for them to know that if you experiment and you like it, it's harder for you to stop doing it. And I've had many patients over the years that tried something once and, in their words, became instant addicts. Tim Willens at MGH found that there's an earlier onset of abuse with ADHD. But what was interesting is about 30% of people with ADHD who use drugs and alcohol were not using it, only 30% were using it to get a high, like that sort of euphoric feeling that we typically think about with the high. However, 70% used it to basically medicate or self-medicate their ADHD symptoms, for sleep problems, for mood improvement. So what is the appeal of drugs and alcohol? It increases dopamine, it increases focus. People do it for stress relief, numbing emotional pain, to regulate mood. But it's so important, and I could give a whole, I've been, especially in this past year, been doing a lot of talks on cannabis and ADHD. It is not a medication or a treatment for ADHD. It is not medicinal. And I really, really encourage everybody to dive deeper in this, because there is a real epidemic of cannabis use in this country. That this is National Institute of Drug Abuse that shows that 1.3% of eighth graders are using marijuana on a daily basis. 1.3%. 11.8% of eighth graders have used marijuana in the past. With seniors in high school, 6.4% of them are using it daily. Almost 36% have used it over the last year. And people with ADHD will say it helps me focus. I'm less bored. It helps me sleep. It makes things more fun. It grounds me, stops my racing brain. And I tell them, all of those things are true. I'm not invalidating that. However, that doesn't mean it's good for you. It doesn't mean it's medicinal. And large studies have found that people with ADHD are twice more likely to develop cannabis use disorder or an addiction, and you can be addicted to weed. People think you can't, you can. THC levels, the weed today is not your grandfather's weed. It is the typical THC levels in 1990 of weed was about 4%, now is about 13%. And that's if someone's just using a mild form. Edibles, you can have THC levels up to 50 to 60%. And then other forms and ways that people can use cannabis, and particularly extracting THC, could be up to 80%. That's almost a different substance in the brain, frankly. So ADHD, you'll often see in these samples of people with cannabis use disorder. And the truth is, what cannabis use does, particularly for a developing brain, which is for someone with ADHD before the age of 27, 28, is it basically exacerbates what is already vulnerable in the ADHD brain. Motivation, memory, attentional focus, learning, processing, executive functions, coordination, time perception, all of those things, it makes it a lot worse. Driving ability, reduced impulse control issues. So in the long term, it actually makes the ADHD worse. Willen's found much higher relapse in people with ADHD. However, it's so important that the ADHD has to be managed for successful sobriety. If ADHD is not treated or managed for someone who's a substance abuser, they're almost guaranteed to relapse. The use of stimulant medication is sometimes frowned upon in drug treatment, and it should not be. Stimulants are not a violation of sobriety for someone with ADHD. In fact, studies have extensively showed that for people with ADHD, using stimulants decreases their prevalence for relapse. So you want to treat the ADHD as well as all of the other methods that we have of treating substance abuse. But it's important with any kind of medical treatment or condition is to take into consideration, and I recently gave a talk to physicians about really being compassionate about and aware of their ADHD patients who might forget to take their medication. Sometimes they might call for a refill, and sometimes it can look like drug-seeking behavior, even though some of the medications are not even sort of typical drug-seeking drugs. And the doctors are like, I can't imagine, like, and one of the physicians I spoke with recently said that he had a patient who he lost his cholesterol medication 5 times in a month. Couldn't find it. And the doctor was convinced that he was selling it or doing something. And he's like, could it be that somebody could really lose? And I said, absolutely. Now, that doesn't mean, you obviously have to have a conversation about how to work with that, rather than, you don't want the guy to have 30, refills of a medication, but you want him to have his medication. But that's where we have to be compassionate and understanding how to engage and validate these concerns, because people feel a tremendous amount of shame around these kinds of issues. Having an untreated ADHD can undermine the treatment of any medical, psychological, or neurodiverse condition, including ADHD. So it's always important to keep ADHD in focus. People with ADHD are less likely to get annual physical exams. So what I always implore people to do, once you get a physical exam, make your appointment for the next year and that appointment right there. Ask your doctor if they can, most of the time now, doctors will text, and they have these automatic text messaging. That works beautifully for people with ADD to get those reminders. People with ADHD often don't go to the doctor until something is really bad or life-threatening. We want them to go in more proactive ways. But for people with ADHD, it can be hard to think in those proactive ways. They might have that sort of attitude, what I don't know won't hurt me. They might be less likely to comply with doctor's orders, not out of oppositionality, but because of executive functioning issues. Sometimes it's hard to deal with all the executive demands of health. So treatment for ADHD, I'm going to stress again, along with those related health risks, can add an average of 9 to 13 years to the lifespan of those diagnosed with ADHD. ADHD alone is not hazardous to your health. It's not treating or managing your ADHD that is the culprit to good health. We need to use those ADHD tools to manage all of those executive demands of health and really reduce the shame and help people understand that these things are hard. Like I remember in college, well, there are many examples. When I was 10, I remember being at Chuck E. Cheese when it was cool to have birthday parties at Chuck E. Cheese, and I was at a friend's party, and there was a lot of pizza left over, and I love pizza, and the mom said, "Oh, guys, eat the pizza. I don't want to waste it." And we had all already eaten, and a lot of people said, "Oh no, I'm fine, I'm full," and even though I was full, I was satisfied. But I remember turning to my friend and saying, "Wait, oh, you don't like the pizza?" And he said, "No, I like the pizza. I'm just full." And I'm like, "Oh, you mean you didn't like this pizza?" He's like, "No, I like that pizza. I'm just not hungry." And I kid you not, I could not understand, if you like pizza, it's in front of you. Why wouldn't you have it? It's there. But again, what I was lacking in that moment was that interoceptive awareness. When I meet somebody who says, "I just eat because I have to," I'm like, "Are you a unicorn?" I don't understand that. Like, I love food. So I recognize that I have definitely those addictive traits and qualities, and there are good parts of that can move you in directions. Like my love of music, definitely a lot of my friends would say has an addictive quality to it, but it's fine. I don't. Granted, I have 3,000 CDs. So when I was in college, I spent tons of money on CDs, but that's a healthy addiction. Exercise, as long as it's not compulsive, and because that can run into eating disorder territory, but that's part of having ADHD, is that is not going to go away. That is, somebody is always going to be oriented that way. We just want to put them in a category where they're more healthy and not shame them for that. And the truth is, lots of people eat healthily, they exercise, they wake up at 5 a.m, go to the gym, and that is not that easy for a lot of people to do. And unfortunately, a lot of my patients that I work with feel inferior because they have a hard time doing that. So we want to sort of reduce that shame. So we have about 10 minutes or so, and for any questions.
Awesome. That was amazing. Thank you so much. And I relate too well to the pizza story. And on the same lines of food, there was a question about the Feingold diet, which I believe is cutting out artificial food. So I don't know if you could share any thoughts or opinions on the Feingold diet.
Yeah, so studies are actually not robust in finding that it reduces ADHD. I mean, I think part of it, and there's as much great information that's out there around ADHD and good resources, there's a lot of misinformation. And one of them that still lingers is that, again, sugar causes ADHD. Poor diet causes ADHD. Now, poor diet absolutely is not good for our energy, for our attention, for our mood, absolutely. But it's not going to get rid of ADHD. So studies will find, for example, when people cut out artificial sugars and things like that, that it's not so much the effect of that as much as what they're eating instead. So because they're not maybe eating those sugars, they're eating more protein, they're eating better food. And that's sort of, a lot of times, I mean, the truth is, for a lot of people with ADHD, they can't stick to those kinds of, any kind of diet really, it's not useful. You really want something that's going to be sustainable, that's going to be, long-term. That's why diets in general really fail, because they're not going to be sustainable. You really want to make it more of a life, thing. Now, having said that, there are some people that have sensitivities or allergies to dyes and food preservatives and things like that. So some of those things like gluten allergies and things like that absolutely would help. But for the majority of people or parents that I work with, I tell them you could do that. It's not going to have the kind of, robust finding as much as adding certain foods will.
And while we're on this topic, could you also just talk about your thoughts on prescription medications, like Adderall, etc.?
Absolutely. So with ADHD, as from a psychopharmacological perspective, the medication of choice are stimulants. There are non-stimulants as well, but stimulants are the ones that are probably more widely prescribed. Not everyone with ADHD takes medication. Not all of them have to take medication. And at the same time, I always tell people medication does not have to be a last resort. It's not taking the easy way out. They're very effective for a lot of people. And the beauty with stimulants is it has a very short half-life, which means the day you take them, how they feel. If your child is taking them, literally within 24 hours. It's not like an antidepressant. You need at least 2 to 3 weeks in your system to really see some effects. So there are a plethora of different ADHD meds, and there is no algorithm right now as to why some people respond to Ritalin more than Vyvanse or Focalin more than Adderall. So there is a lot of trial and error, sometimes where one might cause someone to be agitated, another one doesn't cause agitation, but it also doesn't help them with focus, and another one that's just right. And then of course the dosage levels. And if it doesn't work or somebody doesn't like the side effects, with their prescriber, of course, guidance, they go off it, and it basically washes out of your system within a day. So it's probably the class of medication that's most trial friendly in terms of trying and figuring out. But I have to tell you, I mean, when it comes to a lot of these health things, I work with men with eating disorders. That's one of my other worlds that I've been a part of for many years. And there's a high prevalence of ADHD in people with binge eating disorder and bulimia, binging, and people who binge and purge. And I remember years ago seeing a lot of ADHD and having to work with psychiatrists, because I don't prescribe medication, and saying, I really think this person, they have ADHD, they need a stimulant that I think is going to help them. Now, in the eating disorder community, stimulants were very much frowned upon, seeing them as contraindicated, because it's like, well, because there are people with eating disorders who abuse stimulants who do not have ADHD, who take stimulants to suppress their appetite. And lo and behold, now, what is the first FDA approved drug for binge eating disorder is Vyvanse, which is an ADHD medication. And they're finding that it's not that it kills the appetite, but it regulates the appetite. And I remember one of the first patients that I worked with who had it, he was binging at least once, sometimes 2 to 3 times a day, 7 days a week for years. And he took Vyvanse. He said for the first time, he actually felt like he had a decision. Like he felt like there was like a pause button, and he was able to say, do I want to do this or not? He said that never happened before. And those binge episodes dwindled to like 3 a week. We went from like 7 to 20 a week to 3 times a week, lost a tremendous amount of weight because he was very overweight from binge eating the calories. It really changed his life. So it could be very, very helpful.
Awesome. And I had a couple points myself that I was going to bring up, but I want to open it up for any of the attendees that had questions if they wanted to ask one real quick. So I'll give it a couple seconds. So one thing that I wanted to bring up, which is actually something that we had talked about in one of our, conversations over the year. Oh, hang on. Jen, yeah, there you
go. So admittedly, I came late. I apologize. I had a client. Did you talk at all about meditation?
I didn't. I didn't, but meditation, absolutely very, very useful. One of my very good friends and colleagues, his name is Mark Burton, Bertin, highly recommend. He has many books, and this is his he's sort of known as the mindfulness ADHD guy in the ADHD community. He's written fantastic books about it. And even interestingly, you know, with meditation, mindfulness, I remember when I first met him and I was like, ADHD and mindfulness, is that an oxymoron? Like, is that possible? And when he taught me and I started to understand more about what mindfulness was, and again, the impression I had was like, you know, your mind has to go blank. My mind has never, ever been blank, ever. And he's like, no, he goes, all mindfulness is you're aware of the present moment and being aware. Very, very useful. There are a lot of robust studies looking at the importance of mindfulness, just in terms of stress level, definitely with eating. I mean, I do a lot of mindful eating techniques with patients, like just even, you know, eating, putting their utensil down and chewing and then swallowing, and it's like foreign to them initially. But yeah, highly recommend meditation, mindfulness, finding ways of grounding oneself. But I highly recommend Mark's books. He's actually coming out with a new one, I believe this month on, it's a workbook designed just for teens with ADHD and mindfulness.
Say his name again. Would you say his
Sure,
name?
sure. It's Mark Burton, Bertin. He's a developmental pediatrician in Pleasantville, New York. And he's fantastic. And if you check him out on YouTube, he undoubtedly has lots of great YouTube lectures. He's just real, and he really talks, he walks the walk, you know, he's really great. And another mindfulness expert is Christopher Willard, Willard, who's actually based in Massachusetts as well. He's a big mindfulness expert, and he has done a lot of great work with mindfulness and ADHD. He has some great books out too.
Yeah, Chris is great.
Yeah, he's awesome.
And you can bring a horse to water, as they say, but
Yes, yeah,
especially a teen horse.
yeah.
Well, Roberto, thank you again. This was awesome. Really appreciate your time. And for those of you that live in the Hingham area too, we're having an open house tomorrow. Actually, it's our newest campus. If you wanted to like virtually see our space, so I figured I'd mention that as well. And I actually have our head of school from the Hingham campus here as well, Jacob Weaver. So I don't know, Jacob, if you want to say goodbye to everyone or anything.
Hey everyone, yeah, so I'm the head of school at our newest campus in Hingham. Would also be happy to show you around in person, but we do have the virtual open house tomorrow. But yeah, would love to show you around. So feel free to reach out anytime. You can find my contact information on the website. And if you wanted to write it down, it's just J for my first name, Weaver, Weaver @fusionacademy.com.
Awesome. Roberto, once again, thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure. It's always great seeing everyone. And if anyone has any questions, you know, my email address was on, you know, the slide. Feel free to shoot me an email.
I will send that out as well after.
Great. Awesome. Great. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yep. Bye-bye.